Saudi woman yesterday who almost lost her limbs, who's hospitalized as well. So just if you could observe, maybe just a quick moment of silence, and then we'll get started. I'm actually in Roxbury. Many of you know the orange line. It's different than the red line. If you've been on it, the lights are a little darker, and it's hard to hear the lady when she says, "Where are you going to stop?" It kind of sounds like Charlie Brown's teacher, if you've watched Charlie Brown. And what I would do is, obviously, I'm not in the state of mind to give the talk that I intended to give, but I will not wing it. I do something, it's a secret that you should know, and I learned this from Martin Luther King Jr. You give the talk that you're going to give before you give it, if that makes sense. So I was in Detroit and I gave this talk as a practice run, although I only gave a part of what I plan to do. So what I'll do is just share that with you, to be honest with you. But let me first talk about what has happened as far as the ISBCC in Roxbury since yesterday's tragedy, and some of the points that might interest you. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, some of our congregants were injured. We have a practitioner who from Saudi Arabia is a student. These are the Saudis that you don't hear about. Brilliant young woman who almost lost her limbs. And there's a piece about her in the Washington Post. We had over 50 Muslim first responders from our community who have gone out, volunteered, and are serving the city at any level available. Most of them are physicians, of course. Thirdly, we offered the center at ISBCC to be a place for people who need disaster relief or any assistance, people who need a place to stay, or if they need counseling, we have counselors there through our health initiative. The other thing that we've done is reach out, of course, to, and this is what makes Boston a very beautiful city, very unique city, compared to where I've lived before. There's a very rich, mature interfaith discourse within the community that has really not only, affected this tragedy, but I say all the time that Jews and Christians built the mosque. There was such a spirit of brotherhood and fraternity at the time that we were trying to build ISBCC that came from Muslims, non-Muslims, and atheists. You name it, it was a community project, and that's why we really like to say that the ISBCC is like Boston's mosque. I don't have an accent yet, so I'll try my best. Therefore, we opened it in that way. And then even we had community members who offered their homes to any of the people who might have needed a place to stay, but it looks like there was a lot of work already done. There was an article today that came out. I was interviewed this morning by the Huffington Post, where I was a little, I think, brash, to say the least. And then there was a planned interview tonight with MSNBC, but it's been canceled because I'm at Harvard and not able to do it. But it's great to be here with you anyways. And that's where we are. There's going to be a prayer breakfast or prayer, interfaith prayer on Thursday at 11 o'clock with the governor, with the mayor, and it looks like President Obama will also be there as well. So there's a number of things going on, and what I've tried to do with the man who interviewed me today from the Huffington Post, he was really negative. He was like, "Are you guys under siege? Is anyone trying to kill you?" And I said, I don't want you to write an article like this. We're not under siege. No one's trying to kill us. The community has been overwhelmingly positive. We don't feel that we're under siege. We feel that we need to be proactive and engage with as much positivity as we can. To idfa' billati ahsan in the Quran, repel a negative with a positive. So we have not had any negative experiences. We received a letter today, and this happened to me. I'm originally from Oklahoma, as you can tell. And in 9/11, we had a neighbor in Oklahoma who sent me a letter, and she said, I have a big boy, which means her son, and I have a big shotgun. And if you like, I can send them both over to protect your temple. Okay? So I told her, thanks a lot, but no thanks. We'll just take your big prayers, your big boy and his big old gun. So if you kind of watch Justified, she kind of sounded like Mr. Crowder. And today also we received a letter, an email from a neighbor in that area, Mission Hill area, where Donna Summers is from, if you know who Donna Summers is. She's the Alicia Keys of the 70s. And basically saying that I'm at your service as your neighbor and willing to be of any assistance. So very positive, and that's because there's been a lot of grassroots efforts done in the community from the health initiative that's partnered with Wheeler. What are your health claim to the interfaith work that's happened? So everything's good on our end and in the community, and just continue to be Boston. It's a very resilient city. It's a famous city for its resiliency and its ability to band together in difficult times. That being said, this is a heck of a topic, and under the stress that I'm under and the obvious fatigue, I'll do my best. I flew in last night. And that is the secular mosque. Those of you who are familiar with Harvey Cox, you should be. You're at Harvard, and in 1965, he wrote what I consider one of the masterpieces in contemporary American theology, whether you're Muslim, Christian, or Jew, or Hindu, or whatever. In fact, it spearheaded kind of the liberation theology. The theological movements based on liberation in South America, which kind of shocked him, and he mentions that in his memoirs. And what he talked about are three important points, and I'm not going to talk about the entire book. It's a masterpiece. I encourage you to read it. But those are conclusions that I've had over time, serving as an imam and being engaged in the community, and seeing some of the hyper-reactiveness towards engagement. And sometimes I noticed that it was just absolute, ridiculous fear. And, Ahmed Shawqi, those of you who are Egyptian, Ahmed Shawqi is your Jay-Z. Ahmed Shawqi has a very beautiful poem about fear. And it's a very profound poem, and I'll just say this. You're in Harvard, so it shouldn't be too hard to get this across. Don't be an ant, basically, is the theme of this poem, Al-Namla wal-Muqattam. And this is a poem about a small ant. In Cairo, there's these rather large hills. The Egyptians like to call them mountains, but they're not. And they're called Mu'attam or Muqattam, and they're right behind, this large graveyard area. So he wrote about this ant, and this ant one day was climbing, and suddenly she looked up and she said, "Wow, I'm on a mountain, but I'm an ant. Ants shouldn't be on mountains." And she goes through this whole kind of metacognition thing. Erickson and Piaget would have been pleased with her. She's going through this kind of internal discussion, and then, he says about it, it's very beautiful. Talks about this ant, and then she gets really scared, and her legs waver, and then she begins to run down the hill because she convinced herself that something's going to harm me. Fear. And he said very beautifully in Arabic, سَقَطَتْ فِي شِبْرِ مَاءٍ هُوَ عِنْدَ النَّمْلِ كَالْيَمْ. He said that she fell in a puddle, and a puddle to an ant is an ocean, and then she started to drown in this puddle. And then she said, I should never have listened to my fears. I should have never listened to fears that I had. And then he says in the last line of this poem, صَاحٍ لَا تَخْشَ عَظِيمًا فَالَّذِي فِي الْغَيْبِ أَعْظَمُ. Very beautiful. He said, exactly. He said, don't fear something that's great in front of you, because what you don't see could ultimately be more dangerous or more harmful to you. So the idea of engagement, and in my short career, albeit not that important, that introduction was a little over the top, to be honest with you. I'm just an imam in Roxbury. And what I've noticed is that we tend to have fears that keep us from engagement. And I concluded a long time ago that it was the engagement that was the remedy. And this was before I read Professor Cox. And I had talked to other imams who had really come to similar conclusions, like Abdullah Hamid Ali of Zaytuna, Imam Mark Manley in Philadelphia, Imam Dawood Wadid in Detroit, and others. And then I came across this book. I saw the title, and I had actually deep conversation with Dr. Sherman Jackson about, how do we engage secularization, not secularism, because they're two very different things. And Dr. Sherman, all of us who know Dr. Sherman, he's very animated, his eyes got that West Philly, shine, and he said, exactly, I've been wrestling with this question for 20 years, and then I said, but you were scared to ask somebody about it, weren't you? Within, the clergy field. And he said, yeah, exactly, I was worried that maybe someone would take me out. As Shawqi said, don't be scared of what you don't see, don't be scared of what you see, because what you don't see may be, of course, of greater harm. And then I came across this book called Secular City. I'd been wanting to read it for a long time. He has another wonderful book, of course, When Jesus Came to Harvard, which I think is pretty cool. Maybe you should do When Muhammad Came to Harvard, see where that takes you, When Buddha came to Harvard, or whatever religious leader you follow, or maybe when Richard Dawkins came to Harvard, if that's your cup of tea. But certainly very profound, and that class actually was sold out when he taught it. They had to have it in the theater because so many people were interested in it. And again, what I love about that is since 1965, and he would be best able to talk about himself, and his colleagues are here, some of my teachers are actually in the room, but you see a pattern of him trying to kind of live that engagement. And a lot of times, theology, I consider sometimes some theology that we utilize is cheap. I talked about this on Face the Nation, where it's easy to paint the world as a toilet gone wild, and you have the toilet paper. That's very easy. It's easy to paint the world as a dark, evil place, because in contrast to that, you could basically present anything and people are going to feel good about it. It will kind of be like The Walking Dead. You know that show? You get that here? The Walking Dead. It's a pretty interesting show. It's a double entendre, right? They're dead and they're alive and they're running from the dead people. It's pretty interesting. But in The Walking Dead, have you ever seen when they found shelter, how they react? They could like find anything. It could be like an outhouse. Like, yeah, we're going to crash in this outhouse for a month. We're going to turn this outhouse into a pleasure palace. And now where are they living? Who knows? See who's studying.
Prison.
Come on, man. You're supposed to be studying, bro. They're in prison. Yeah, me too. That's what my wife says. Aren't you supposed to review Quran? Yeah, I am. Where's Rick? So they're actually living in a prison. A prison has become a palace for these people. So the same thing applies to cheap theology. You know, if we paint the world as the most disgusting, not for anything, and forgive me, I'm so tired, I can barely talk, that the world is just falling apart and everything around us is going to hell and the apocalypse is in 5 minutes, I can say anything and people will be like, God bless you, that was amazing. My iman has been increased. My faith has been revised. I consider that cheap theology. A cheap theology. Because we should not only be able to use the apocalypse to inspire people, as I learned in the South when I went to the Church of Christ with my grandmother as a young boy in Tonkawa, Oklahoma, okay? But also we should be able to take the best that the world has to offer and empower people to see the grace of God within that. And that's why one of my teachers, he was a Sufi, he said, the remembrance of God is about contextualizing Him in your daily life. And we know that in the Quran, those of us who are Muslims, we have وَأَمَّا بِنِعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ فَحَدِّثْ, that we are supposed to celebrate the blessings of God and announce them to others. So I had struggled with some of the discourses that I've seen, and I realized that sometimes those discourses, what Sheikh Dr. Amr Wadani, we used to talk about tasweedul hayat, turning the life just to a morbid place. And at that moment in time, if people buy into that, then theology becomes cheap. Now my question became about the object of that sentence, the people. Why do they buy into that? And as a convert to Islam, and I don't know about the part about I'm going to talk about Islamic fundamentalism. I plan to talk about Islam in America. That's me. That's what I can talk about. That's my reality, and that's who I am. But I would ask myself, why do people buy into these things? How is it that someone could buy into the fact, I remember in the early 2000s, there was a group who told people that the apocalypse was going to happen in Lebanon. If you go to this mountain and you look to the east, the Mahdi will appear and the world's over. And people went. And they gave a lot of money, right? When I was in San Francisco, I believe a year or two ago, remember the doomsday preacher? Who told people, next month the world is going to end, so give me all your money. That's brilliant on his part. And then he died after he got all their money. It was horrible. God, he died on me. He had a big funeral, though, of course. So he asked people for their money, and this is in Stanford, no offense, Berkeley, these bastions of liberalism and heathenism, and there people gave him money. And then the world didn't end. So I began to ask myself, these are people who graduated and have PhDs. These are not illiterate human beings. They did well in their studies. So I started to think about the object. And then I restricted that to the Muslim community, and I tried to study. I love sociology, so I tried to kind of study certain trends. And I came to a few conclusions. Number one is with the convert community. So I'll start with us because I converted to Islam in 1992. My first Imam was Rakim. My first Sufi tariqa was Public Enemy, and my first Sufi guru was KRS-One. And at that time, I accepted Islam. And I remember when I converted to Islam, an absolute state of fear socially, because I did not know where I belonged. And I remember I was given like Pakistani clothes, so I thought that'll make me a better Muslim, and I'll look like MC Hammer. So I put on the Pakistani clothes. I went to school in Oklahoma, of all places, Oklahoma, with Pakistani clothes on. Large, corn-fed Gorasab. White dude, Gorasab, going to college in Oklahoma. And then my friends stopped being my friends. And I couldn't figure out why. And I used theology to justify, oh, these infidels, they don't understand the truth. You know, this bonanza, shalwar kameez is the way to go. Shalwar kameez is that long shirt that they wear. Really comfortable at night. And then I remember I was told to change my name. So I changed my name. And then I exchanged CK1 for this really profoundly strong smelling strange thing in a bottle. And I had really changed my total social reality in order to gain some type of comfort in authenticating my religious experience. I was 19 years old. And I'll give you a good example. My mother is from Tonkawa, Oklahoma. Okay? She has a master's degree in English literature, which was always a problem for me. And I was sitting at the dinner table with her, and she had served potato, baked potato. That's called comfort food down south. And I pulled out some hot sauce, started dumping it on this potato. And my mother looked at me as though she saw a unicorn, as though she discovered the dodo bird in the back of her yard in Oklahoma, this extinct creature. And she said to me, "Are you putting hot sauce on a baked potato?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she's like, "That religion changed it." It wasn't Greek yogurt instead of sour cream. It was hot sauce. Okay. Now, there's always humor, but there's always something going on in the background, okay? And the point was, my mother was like, "What the hell happened to my son?" Now, what I started to do is talk to converts. We had around 250 in the last year in Roxbury, and I would ask them and speak with them, and what I discovered is that when you convert to Islam, one of the greatest challenges that you face is being lonely. You lose certain aspects of your social life that make it very difficult. And if you don't have a filler to replace it, you're going to find other avenues to replace those things. Psychology. And coupled with that is the lack of an American Muslim theology. We have an imported theology, and that's why our masajids are rocked with Eastern illnesses. When it comes to debates, it's not about, are we going to follow the Protestant ethic of working hard? Are we going to say once saved, always saved like the evangelical Baptists? Or are we going to argue something else based on, the Campbell-esque understanding of the Church of Christ? No, we're busy arguing about Sufi tariqas that were born in Sudan. That's important in America. No offense to my Sudani homies. I'm sorry, we're in Harvard, my Sudani counterparts. So, we've seen that communities have tended to be rocked by Eastern-oriented theology because of the lack of I would say, a curriculum even in the English language. And if we look at the work of converts, it's reflected an insecurity, and that is that we have been great in translating classical books to people, right? But where are the original texts that we say, for example, our Malaysian counterparts have original books written by Malay scholars for Malaysian people? So a Muslim convert will pick up a book of Maliki fiqh. I'm trained in the Maliki madhab. And he'll get to the chapter on wudu and awrah for salah, covering yourself for prayer. And then suddenly he'll come across the chapter that the awrah for a free woman is different than the awrah for what? For a slave woman. Why on earth would you translate that in a post-civil rights America? But the insecurity complex sometimes drives us to make taqleed. Shaykh al-Ghumari, rahimahullah, talked about this taqleed, which is madmoon. and which some of our scholars in Azhar would talk to me about, simply just turning off your brain. And that's the fruit of fear, usually. And that's why in movies they always run from the monster. And what do? They always trip, right? Because they don't use their brain. Neither did the director. So within the convert community, it can be rooted in a number of things. Secondly, can you imagine, I memorized the Quran. When you memorize the Quran in the Muslim country, what do you guys do when someone memorizes the Quran? You get down. You get busy, yo. You get like the DJ with all the halal nasheed. You get it going. I memorized the Quran and went home to a dark house. And my mom was like, well, were you up there in Norman, son? What'd you do? Oh, I just memorized the Quran. Okay, great. Congratulations. Can you bring me my water? Right? And that's not to say that my mother's bad, but she doesn't understand how profound that accomplishment is. Later on, she was able to appreciate that. So the point is that loneliness and that lack of kind of social cohesion, and that's why we talk to people who left Islam in America. And here's a common statement that I hear from people. I left the community. I didn't leave the theology. I left the community. I didn't leave the theology. And that's because you go kind of through this authentication process and you don't have much to bounce things off of. So you end up using the dominant culture in the masjid or the mosque or the Islamic center to kind of authorize your Islam. The second was with the immigrant community, and this is a challenge. And I feel in many ways the immigrant community is unfairly made, kind of the object of certain attacks. I think we are all responsible for our successes as we are for our failures to some degree. But when I talk with immigrants, it's basically like, I don't want my kids to be American. As though America is kind of like just this universal bad thing. It's like the boogeyman. And that's a very subjective concept. What does it mean to be an American? The guy that's saying that to you has on Levi's jeans and a polo shirt. So you're like, what part of America do you have a problem with? And when you talk to some of the cha-cha-sobs, and you're like, so when you came to America, those are uncles, what was your favorite music? Oh, I love the Eagles. I love Boston before Brad Delp left. I was really into metal. So then what are you talking about becoming American, bro? I mean, sir, what does that mean? Right? And this fear, and that's why we see some of our Islamic schools, when we survey them and we look at the educational philosophy, you find that it's incubation, not preparation. The idea is, kind of like Nemo's dad. Just don't go. Just stay here. It's like the cruise. If you just saw the cruise, my kids want me to go see it, right? Stay in the cave. Don't leave. But it's not defined. And again, it goes back to what Shoki talked about. These are unseen fears. And what that does, it creates kind of a hyper-reactiveness. The other areas within our own community that people will use sometimes text in a way to create the dominant theological argument is that which is more stricter. What the scholars of classical Islamic law, Shatibi calls it ihtiyatan. Let's just be safe. Let's just waive the most conservative opinion we can, fahmul khitab, and then by default, the worst of the worst will be like in the makruh. Right? But when we read, especially the books of law, the books of living law, which are found in the traditional schools, we find that it's not always the case. Even Rajab al-Hanbali, in Jami' Ulum al-Hikam, this great scholar, he talks about how it's not always the best to stay away from the mutashabihat, the doubtful issues. In fact, there are times when it might be commendable for a person to engage in the gray area, to save them from other things. The other areas that scholars were not concerned only about hyper-liberalism. They were also deeply concerned about hyper-conservatism. Al-ifrat and tafrit. But that discourse that we're seeing, and that's why, for example, a man came to me one day and said, there's no way you're an imam. And this wasn't impossible to clarify. This was a long time ago, someone you would never know. And I said, really? How? He said, you're white. I was like, what the heck? How do you respond to that? It's like, O'Reilly or something. And then I said, okay. And he said, and you wear suits. He said, those two, go against Islam. So I was like, I wish you told me that before I accepted Islam. that something can change. Someone will embrace Islam, and the dominant opinion of our great scholars is it can be in the language that they speak. Duh. So, they'll say the statement of testimony in English, and undoubtedly 5 or 6 people will come to me and say, is there Islam real? And I was like, why? Because they didn't say it in Arabic. So then I'll say to the guy, أتتحدث بلغة العربية? Do you speak Arabic? And he's like, huh? What are you talking about? So then I said, okay, repeat after me. أريد أن أخرج وأبيع باب غنوج برا عند العربة. I said, congratulations, you just sold eggplant outside. But it's rooted in fear. And while there's humor going on, and we can look at it in a humorous way, that fear sometimes is good. But when it's left uncontrolled, and when it's not, balanced out with rational thinking, and looking at kind of the goals that we'll talk about in a minute of our faith, it becomes a problem. It leads to ifrat, hyper-extremism. The third community that I've seen are the children of immigrants. I say this with respect to everyone. And again, the idea of it's kind of like that De La Soul song, me, myself, and I. I don't even know who I am. So I ask people all the time, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Khartoum. I'm from Imbaba. I'm from Palestine. I'm from Syria. I'm from Urdun. I'm from, Malaysia. Really? Where were you born? Compton. The heck? Bro, you're from Compton. You're from the CPT. I was born in, one brother, he told me, Ana rah al balad. I'm going to my country. I said, really, where's your country? And he said, of course, Cairo, Egypt. And I said, where were you born? I was born in Kansas. So I said, have you ever been to Cairo? No. Right? So it's kind of reflective of a mentality that is not really certain of where it belongs. There's a psychosis that exists, and it's a dangerous psychosis. And when you couple that with fear, people tend to struggle. Now, I want to touch on 3 points that Cox touches on in the beginning of his book, and just add kind of our theological stance on this. And feel free to differ with me. I don't get upset if people differ. I welcome that. I love that. I learn from people. One of the most beautiful things about this job is the ability to learn theology from people who live it. I studied it. You live it. And what I've experienced is that people who live theology tend to have more meaningful experiences with God than any book I could ever read. Of course, outside of our sacred text. But the sacred text has to be lived. When Aisha was asked about the prophet's character, she said he was a walking Quran. He experienced it. He had meaning to his religious experience. And in Islam, there are 2 important questions we have to ask ourselves before I get into his 3 points. And that is our religion meaningful? Have we digested it and thought about it? Ibn Taymiyyah says something that strikes me every time I read it. He said, every day of my life I accept Islam again. Now, every day of my life I convert. Meaning I examine my relationship and the meaning that I have in my own life with faith. And I think many of us have outsourced that meaning to others. And that's why sometimes we just, I'm not a Molvi Saab dude, I'm not a sheikh, I'm not an imam. These are the most irrational people I've ever seen in my life. It's all good, but I'm not that. But we outsource the dominant meaning of Islam to a certain given group of people, whereas you are living that meaning. I had a teacher in Egypt one time. I came to him, he was crying. Very righteous person, old man. And I said to him, why are you crying? And he said, today I learned repentance from someone. So I thought, oh, you met some great scholar and he mentioned some euphemism, or maybe you read some profound text and you discovered true meaning of repentance. So I asked him, what book did you find this in? Or what sheikh did you hear this from? Teacher. And he said, no, I met this sinner who came to me brokenhearted, but crying to God for his mercy. And he said, that sinner taught me the meaning of repentance. More than anything I've read, and more than anybody I've said. So, what does faith, and this applies, I think, to other religions too, as a young Christian, I had this question, what does this faith mean to me outside of Matthew, Mark, Jackson, Letters to the Romans, memorizing all of those incredible songs, Onward Christian Soldiers, of course, in the South is a favorite of some of our evangelical churches. Outside of those songs, I begin to ask myself, what does it mean to me as a person, as an individual? How do I see faith in my own sphere? And I think we have to encourage people to do that in America. Again, I think that our relationship with the imams, and I'll talk about this in the future, and religious leadership is based on fear. Even if we don't respect them intellectually, we'll go through the motions. People come to me all the time, except in Boston where we're mad homies, and they'll come to me and they're like, I'm sorry. Why? I need to ask a question. Why would you be sorry? You wouldn't go to Martin Gans and be like, I'm sorry. Can I ask you a question? You're like, I'm going to ask this guy a question. It's going to be the greatest moment of my life. This is going to be amazing. Right? If Cornel West walked by, we would have a million questions to ask him. But we've created this dichotomy with our own community, and I think that theologians tend to do that because we know that our training is not apt to deal with transmodern America, in all honesty. And the way that you make up for that is to have this kind of circus kind of scene, to dress a certain way, to claim to have an esoteric relationship that no one else can measure. Therefore, you scare the heaven out of people, not the hell out of people. And I don't like it. And that might be my Protestant DNA kicking in. But I don't like it. Number two is our religion has to be sustainable. We have to think about the practices that we employ in our life. Are they going to be sustainable amongst our children and their children? The type of communities that we build. My daughter does not pray behind any man's wall or any woman's wall. Why? Because I want her to be empowered as a woman. I want my son to go to a mosque and leave the mosque and say, man, that Imam rocks. This masjid is baller. When he goes to public school and his friend says, my mom likes Joel Osteen because Joel Osteen has mad shine. Okay, whether you agree with his theological stances is another thing, but the man does have a very charismatic style. He does offer people something which I think is important, hope. It won an election. Actually, it won two. So I want my son, if he's in that conversation with someone and they're asking him about their church, he doesn't feel shy to say, imagine, if you have to tell your friends, well, and they were like, so, who's your preacher? And you're like, I can't see him. Like, well, I'm behind a wall. In Oklahoma, if you told someone you're behind a wall, you know what they would say to you? Did your mother punish you? Because that's how our mothers used to punish us in the South. My mother would put me on a chair and turn me to a wall. Right? Well, I can't see the preacher. Why? Because we have this amazing plaster ensemble, right, that I get to stare at during his talk. And I start to see faces in it, like that's Evil Dead 2, that's Yoda. It's awesome. It encourages my imagination. Right? Who's going to want to talk about that? Whereas you would rather have your son say, or your daughter say, man, I go to the bombest temple, metaphorically speaking, in the city. And I tried this. I was asked one time to give a Friday sermon at a Muslim high school. The night before, I was with my beautiful daughter, Shifa, healing, and we were walking in the mall, and I saw thousands of teenagers. Either it was a Clearasil giveaway, or there was a movie. So I asked my daughter, what the heck is going on? And that was one of those, Dad, you're old, you don't know anything talks, which we all hate to hear. It's called the late 30s. And then I said to her, okay, enough with that. What's going on? She's like, Twilight. Can you take me? Oh, God. We went anyways, but not then. So the next day, I was giving the Friday sermon in a Muslim high school. And I was trying to think of a topic because, to be honest with you, 14-year-olds are the hardest people in the world to talk to. With all respect to you. Wallahi, it's very difficult, by God. So, when I walked in, I decided I'm going to give the khutbah about Twilight. So I gave the Friday sermon about Twilight and the objectification of women. Of course, that might have been over the heads, the part about it's strange that a woman is caught between a vampire and a werewolf with no other opportunities. It's true. And then, what are you calling us men? werewolves and vampires. You know, we have saintly figures in our community. You know, we have Robin Hoods in our community. We have Romeos. We have different types of archetypes of men, not just Steve Austin and vampires and werewolves. Afterwards, the night of that sermon, I went to the mosque, and this one boy ran up to me. He was like, Imam, I have to tell you something. That is the first time I never fell asleep in a Friday sermon. I said to him, listen, we're not Catholics. No offense, there's no need for confession. But I understand, I feel you. And then I said, what happened? He said, I went to play basketball that afternoon with my friends. They always ask me, why do you come home late from school? And I have to tell them, because we're so great at parking, that I get home late from our Friday sermon. And he said, they always ask me, what was the Friday sermon about? And undoubtedly, I always tell them, I have no idea. But this Friday, I ran to the basketball court. And he said, before they could ask me, I said, today we had a khatib who talked about Twilight and God. And I said, what did your friend say? He said, can we come to church with you next week? Now, that is not to say that there was a lot of Twilight, but just enough to make it relevant to people. So we're talking about sustainability. You know, when I was doing my degree in education, one of the things that we talked about is the longevity of a lesson. That a great lesson transcends the student-teacher, goes back to the parents or home giver. There's a discussion there. Could even reach different parts of the community. And then the great lesson is the one that actually does a 360 and comes back and teaches the teacher something. And that is really where, if we are engaging contemporary issues outside of course, popular culture, there's a million other things we can talk about, right? But I didn't think 14-year-olds wanted to hear about revenue distribution in Roxbury and Dorchester. But it comes back. So the beauty of that theological experience is not only are you teaching them something in a way that's meaningful, but ultimately it comes back to you as a teacher, and you find yourself, instead of the subject, the object. And that helps us increase and sharpen up our theological skills, if you know what I mean. Now, the 3 points he made are, there's a difference between secularism and secularization. And I agree with him. And I came to this conclusion a long time ago. Secularization is a historical reality. You can't get around it. And in reading his text, I often thought, what would he have wrote about the internet? And how it's led to kind of a decentralization of religious authority and power. You know, I've given a lesson and someone's come to me and said, you're wrong. And I said, why? Well, I heard this lecture on YouTube. And I was like, really, from who? And they have heard it from a respected scholar. And I was like, that's awesome. That's great that you went and, listened to this lecture, and now you're able to question me, and I found out, guess what? I was wrong. Thanks, man, I appreciate it. It's a powerful now energy that exists within the internet. And he said that historical reality is brought out in 3 ways. Number 1 is that we are no longer enchanted by nature. We don't. For many of us, and I'm not saying this to disrespect anyone or claim a false universal. I'm just quoting him. We don't make nature a god. We don't hear the winds rustle through the weeds in the Charles River and say, oh my God, there's an omen. There's a wizard. There's a dragon that's going to pop out of the Charles River and eat that woman. Or man, sorry. Okay. We don't have that anymore. We've demystified nature. And what I found interesting is his argument is that religion contributed to that. And he, of course, invokes Christianity. Said Christianity brought people from the idea of worshiping nature. And I say that with respect to Wiccans, who might be here. But we find also in the Quran, لا تسجدوا للشمس ولا للقمر. We find in the Quran, God says, don't pray to stars, don't pray to the moon. He demystifies nature. Takes away, of course, not the beauty and the awe that we have for nature, which is, of course, a constant, but the idea that nature can have some kind of, metaphysical and that is that secularism took God out of the equation. So my argument about engagement is that in order to keep an equilibrium between the two, if we're not engaged, Sheikh Mabaya told me, an empty chair can't speak for you. An empty chair cannot speak for you. But engagement. And of course we're talking about evolution, biology. This is what you guys do. You're my teachers, those of you who are in those fields here. But I believe that the reaction of the evangelical movement and people like Harold Yahya, with even in the Muslim community, creationism within the Muslim community, I feel is a great, great, great travesty. That there should be a richer engagement. I'm not giving you my opinion on that because I don't think I'm qualified to. I'm learning how to engage that. But fleeing from it is not an answer. And fleeing from it gives one of the other two authority. The second area that he talked about is that it is a historical fact that religious figures no longer govern. The idea of a divine ruler who has been emboldened by God himself or herself, depending on which way you roll, to declare what's right and wrong for people. We are living in functional and dysfunctional democracies in most situations. And again, if we look at Islam as Muslims, many of us struggle. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهِ. People invoke this verse all the time. Whoever doesn't rule by what God ruled is not a Muslim. But do they understand what this verse means and what this verse is talking about? When we look at our faith as Muslims, we find that there are absolutes in our text which are fixed, which are non-negotiable. Like, for example, praying, making pilgrimage to Mecca, being honest, staying away from fornication. These are things which are fixed. But there are other things which are negotiable. And when we look at classical legal books, I found this always interesting. The Khalil is a good example of this. About 85% of the book, 75% of the book is dedicated to the engagement and creation of political law through time. And most of those laws are not based on God said, the Prophet said, God said, the Prophet said. Many of them are based on analogy, based on comparison to other areas of law, and so on and so forth. The last area that he talked about is values. That values are no longer considered sacred. That can be argued, and that's not my point. I don't have time, nor was I able to catch up before I came on that important question. But I would say that Islam has a very interesting take on values. And that is that we find in the Quran, usually values are mentioned as universals, what are called IAM. So, for example, in the 4th chapter of the Quran, it says, وَعَاشِرُوهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, which means live with your spouse in a nice way. Ma'ruf. It is not defined. In other places, it talks about a divorce and how much money should be spent on the wife who has been divorced. It says, لِيُنْفِقْ ذُو سَاعَةٍ مِّن سَاعَتِهِ وَمَنْ قُدِرَ عَلَيْهِ رِزْقُهُ فَلْيُنْفِقْ مِمَّا آتَاهُ اللَّهُ. And what is prescribed there is that a person should give of what he has the ability to give. Again, a universal ma is used, not a specific or particular. And what that helps us understand is that many of the ethics found in the Quran, as Abu Yusuf, the student of Abu Hanifa, wrote about, have been left ambiguous on purpose. What we call in Arabic al-mujmal, in usul al-fiqh. And the reason for that is that they are defined by what's called al-urf. And urf would mean a cultural custom. In the 7th chapter of the Quran, it says, وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ. God orders his prophet, Muhammad, to respect and honor al-urf. And we have an axiom in the Maliki madhab, al-urfu ka-shart, that custom in these situations where there's ambiguity in the meaning of verses, al-urfu yufassir, that the custom comes and actually explains the meaning and application of a universal value. And why that's important is that it implies that there is negotiation between revelation and society, revelation and community. There's a very interesting legal opinion that took place, and it happened in the life of a great jurist, Hassan al-Basri, who, around the 2nd century, he was sent a question by a general of an army. He said, we came across the people who still marry their sisters. And in the Quran it's very clear, you're not supposed to marry your sister. Thank God for that. I don't have a sister, I'm just joking. See if you're awake. And change the tone on purpose, and now you're falling asleep. I'll tell a joke in a minute. So, he said, don't marry sisters. He said, Sheikh Hassan, these people are marrying their sisters. His response was, أَتَكُنْ عِنْدَهُمْ عَادَةً? Is it a custom? And the response back was, yes. And his response back was, leave them alone and let them learn over time. If I gave an answer like that on SuhaibWebb.com now, everyone in the world would be calling me a modernist. Although we're in trans-modernity, by the way. But those reactions, again, are rooted in fear. You're changing the deen. You're changing the religion of God. I remember once I was talking with a brother who accused me of changing the religion of God. I didn't know it was that important. And I said to him, great. Why? He said, because you answered with this, and you answered with that, and you answered with this. Okay, I didn't answer half of those things you said. It's all good. I think you've changed your religion of the Chicago Manual of Style. You've jacked up research. But listen to this. So I read him some legal opinions of a great jurist. And he said to me, that person is a modernist. So I was going to ask him, who founded modernity? When did it start? Are you able to really discuss what is modernity and Campbell soup on a subway wall, Sex Pistols, stuff like that. And he wasn't. Then I said to him, these are the legal opinions of Umar ibn Khattab, man. These are the legal opinions of the second caliph of Islam. He lived well before the village people. He lived well before modernity, as you know it now. Now, the point that I'm getting at is that Cox, Professor Cox, is a genius. His point, and I'm summarizing, I'm not doing it justice, is that the fear factor, not the bad show that was canceled on ABC, but the fear factor has prohibited people from engaging these things. In the name of God, perhaps we are supporting secularism more than we are thwarting it. In the name of Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, a jihadist can kill someone. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, aiding the cause of the enemies of religion at a policy level, probably more than anyone else could do. So the idea is that in this context of America, and if Islam is going to be sustainable in America, and what I mean by sustainable is not just, we're Muslims. No, I'm talking about like high quality stuff. Not just, we got a place to pray, great. No, I'm talking about, when are we going to start to talk about how the architecture of our mosques will have an influence on our children? The architecture of our mosque has influence on the psyche of women congregants and men congregants. Those are the type of discussions we find in what's called maqasid sharia. And I'm tired of the discussion about the objectives of sharia simply being theoretics. Maqasid sharia was never about theoretics. It was about policy and creating an affinity towards God. Now, the idea of being so scared to engage really has led to, I think, what we would call, I don't like the word fundamentalism, I like the word extremism. On two sides of the fence. And Islam constantly considered extremism from two angles. At-tasahul wa tashaddud. Hyper dispensation just say it for Boston. I can't talk about all of America. I represent a very small congregation. And even in that congregation, I'm sure some people don't like me, so it's probably smaller than what it should be. I think I saw my wife filling out a complaint today, to be honest. And that is that we really need to engage society at all levels. If we ask, and I did this, you ask young Muslims, who is the most influential Muslim in your life in America? You know what the top 3 answers are? What do you think? Then drink some water. What do you think as we finish?
Lupe Fiasco.
That's number 1, Lupe Fiasco. It is. I have never seen more young children pray prayers in Ramadan than the night that Lupe tweeted and said, I'll be at the ISBCC tonight for prayers. We were packed. I was like, man, can you do that every day, dude? ISBCC. Right, you, most deaf, get a little something going. And I never seen so many cameras as well in front of people praying. So Lupe is number 1. Who do you think number 2 is?
Dave Chappelle.
Dave Chappelle, no. And not Charlie Murphy. Most definitely no.
Hakeem Olajuwon.
Hakeem Olajuwon, no. Come on, Daisies, where you at?
He's on sorry.
Zindagi, Bandagi, Shamindagi. Come on.
Azhar Usman.
Azhar Usman, no. Think bigger than that. With all respect to Azhar, that's my boy. Shah Rukh Khan. Who said? You said it? I'll give you a door prize. After the talk, I'll give you this renewable bottle. Shah Rukh Khan. Right? Who do you think number 3 is?
Your mom.
Nah, my mom, I wish. My mom is not Muslim.
Well, not yours. Everybody's mom.
Oh, their mothers. You remember? Our moms. I'm not going to dispute that, because your mom might be here, but the statistic is a little different. What do you think? Hakeem, Mike Tyson, Mos Def, these people who are, you're not finding clergy. They're not saying Yasir Qadi, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, Imam Zaid Shaker. They're talking about people who their meaning relates to more. So we're talking about sustainability in the light of the secular mosque, of course, which is an oxymoron or a double entendre, whatever you want to use. The idea is that perhaps the answer is in the secular mosque. And what I mean by the secular mosque is engagement of secularization, not secularism. And in the Quran, God says, "Ukhrijat linnas," you were sent for the benefit of people. And the lam here, this li, is always translated wrong. It's translated as lam sababiyya. But actually it's lam al-fa'ida, which is the lam of benefit. It's a particle, it's an article, preposition, which carries with it the meaning of for the benefit of. Now, the Prophet also said the best of you are those who benefit people the most. And he gave a very beautiful example in a profound tradition where he said the example of the Muslims and their relationship to humanity are like people on a boat. There are people at the bottom and people at the top. And people at the bottom are saying, please give us water. And the people at the top, Margaret Thatcher died, so in the name of trickle-down economics. Right. People at the top were Thatcheresque. Their ideology kind of ignored those people at the bottom. Said, something will reach them. And after a while, the people at the bottom said, got a good idea. Let's just drill a hole in the boat and get some water. And the Prophet said, everybody drowned. So if we continue, and we're seeing great change, organizations like Imam in Chicago, Zaytuna College, California, CARE, I think is a good example. Yusuf, you hear it, ISBCC. Your MSAs, who are giving a meaning to theology, which many of us are not trained to give, to be honest with you. So we're talking about the secular mosque, which is a planned word just to get some people in the seats, of course. Because the initial topic they gave me, no offense, the fear factor was how you became Muslim. You invite an Azhari sheikh who converted 20 years ago to talk about his conversion? The largest mosque in North England? Talk about his conversion? So I wrote back and said, heaven, no. Conversion was an event that happened 20 years ago. But again, creativity sometimes is not there. And that's why we see in our communities when we talk, can I do this? Can I do that? Is it okay? Like if I show the Umar film, upstairs in the mosque, is it okay if I show that? Like, is it wrong? Because the fear factor. Now, the underlying axiom of Islamic law that I think empowers us to do that is this one. Imam al-Suyuti mentions in Kawakib al-Sati' that this is one of the 5 agreed upon axioms, and the jurists never agreed on anything, so it must be pretty baller. And that is al-aslu fil ashya'i ibaha, that the origins of things is permissibility. It's such a creative axiom. It's such an empowering axiom for Muslims, that the origins of things are permissible unless there's harm at a broader level. The second axiom, as I finish, is mentioned by none other than Imam al-Haramain in his book Al-Burhan. And Imam al-Ghazali built on it, although he differed with him, and Baqinani before them talked about it as well. These are scholars. Of course, I throw some names out there because we know we're in the academy. And that is that the origin of a Muslim's work is based on Jalb al-Masalih wa Dar al-Mafasid. That the origin of our work is to bring benefit, and Imam Ibn Qayyim said in the 7th century, benefit for everyone. Not just the Muslim community, and this is also touched on by An-Nawawi, but for all of humanity, even the environment, and to prevent harm. 2 very, I think, empowering axioms, because when you read sometimes, you should read the descriptions of the companions of the Prophet when they would go to different countries. They were never negative. Read Abu Musa al-Ash'ari's description of Egypt. It sounds like Disneyland. When he wrote a poem about the Nile, he was so overwhelmed with it, he wrote a poem. He wrote a rap, he did a mixtape, back to Umar, talking about how beautiful the Nile is and how incredible the people are and how incredible their food is. He wasn't like, these kufar and this place horrible and the rivers, pollution and all. Because they were empowered to engage and celebrate the grace and glory of God in any situation. As Rakim said, it ain't where you're from, it's where you're at. The second is that we need to create a different paradigm for how we engage with religious scholarship in this country. And that is that the sheikh is not a one-all, do-all person. I have people, unfortunately, last week in Boston, there was a young woman who was raped in our community. May Allah help her. And her parents brought her into the mosque the next morning to meet. And I said to them, why are you here? Like, well, we don't know what to do, and you're the Imam. I said, no, go to the police station, make sure she doesn't clean herself. The idea that our clergy can decide who we marry, who we divorce. In Jordan, there's a scholar, who they can divorce, who they can marry. I think outsourcing that type of authority is against the empowering nature of Islam. Islam was about shura. So, for example, there was an idea of inviting me to Northeastern, let this someone else, while I read it, to talk about evolution. I'm going to talk about evolution. My degree's in Sharia, not biology. So they were shocked when I said, I'm not qualified to talk about that. Well, brother, can't you just, read some wiki articles and grab a few verses of Quran here and there and, just go talk about evolution? I was like, find someone who's qualified in that subject, find a theologian who's qualified in that subject, marry them together, and have them talk. Recently I was at Yale at the IB conference. We didn't see any of you there, by the way. And there's a few. They're mad at you, though. And, when Cornell is dissing you, you're in trouble. So, I was there, and a girl stood up and asked me a question about forensic science. As though, I love CSI, but I don't know much about forensic science, And I said to her, and it was a beautiful moment, I said to her, in this issue, you're my Imam. theology, the physical sciences, and other types of sciences, as well as sociology, and I think we'll be able to together create a meaningful message for ourselves and others. It's not a one-way road. It needs to be a road that's married. And we're seeing this in the Muslim world. And in Egypt, where major fiqh councils, you have doctors, anthropologists, sociologists, along with Sheikh al-Azhar and other scholars. The third is we need to be brave and creative. And we need to be able to take stands on things, and if people get upset with us, so what? And we need to give each other a lot of leeway. You know, today, the article from Huffington Post quotes me as saying, the guy's not a Muslim. I don't recall saying that. In less than 10 minutes, I got like 100 emails. How can you say he's not Muslim? How can you say he's not Muslim? I'm like, man, give me a break. I'm kind of busy today, bro. Like, I happen to be in Boston, hello, right? And then I got to go to Harvard later on, hello. And then NBC after that. Like, I might have made a mistake. And we see what happened to Sheikh Hamza post 9/11. Whether we agreed with what he said or didn't say, the reaction was almost euphoric. And I remember an article on Islam, and this is where I don't think we should give people leeway. There was an article on Islam, one of those overseas Islam in English websites that had the Great White Hope. You know what I mean? That's just ethically wrong. You don't have to be Muslim to find a problem with that, right? And it just blasted Shai. I call Sheikh Hamza Shai. Just blasted Shai to pieces. And people were kind of like quiet about it. Whereas we thought, you know, it was a terrifying experience. 9/11 basically scared us to death. The next day, you've been brought to the White House to meet Emperor Bush. Okay? And you think about it, that would be pretty terrifying. Give people leeway to make mistakes. As we discover theology in America, and as we discover Islam as it grows in America, we have to afford each other some leeway to make mistakes and to have soft hearts. And to, on the way here, you know what happened? I met this uncle at Downtown Crossing. He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Harvard." He said, "That MSA is bakwas." In Urdu, he said, "That MSA is full of beans." And I said, "Why?" "Oh, they used to follow the way of their elders, and they used to this and that, and now they become too progressive." This is that fear factor that I'm talking about. But if we're not fearful, and we believe that as we claim that this religion is protected by providence, right? One of the outcomes of believing that is to be a little bit merciful with each other. And to understand that we are in a prepubescent phase as American Muslims in our creativity. There were other communities, like I think the community of W.D. Muhammad has blown by us. I was in a mosque yesterday in Detroit, Michigan, and they have a jazz cafe, and they don't care what you got to say about it. If you walk in there, well, you know, the Hadith and Bukhari, like music is forbidden. He's like, "I'm doing Count Basie right now. Would you be quiet?" Honestly, they've reached a stage of maturity and comfortability with their Americanness coupled with their theology that it's a beautiful comfortability. I saw it in Malaysia. I went to a heavy metal concert with my wife in Malaysia. It's a long story. You do crazy things when you get married. And when we got there, you know how they started a heavy metal concert? With Fatiha. They read the first chapter of the Quran. And I was like, this is awesome. This is incredible. Because they're so comfortable. I might not be feeling it, but it's incredibly liberating to see how comfortable they are. Then halfway through the show, the drum set, the guy had skills, and he stopped and he said, "I just want everyone to know, these guys got long hair like Wayne's World rejects, you know, Beavis and Butthead, you know." And he's like, "I just want everyone to stop and pray dua for our lead singer whose mother died yesterday." So you got all these like headbangers, like Iron Maiden shirts and stuff, and they're like, I was like, this is surreal. Is Keanu Reeves gonna like fly by and say, what the heck is going on? And then I realized, and I think Dr. Umar talked about this, the cultural imperative in Islam, that they're comfortable in their skin, and that they do have critics, but the critics who criticize them are not just brutal. A case study. Go look at the movie Unmasked and look at the comments underneath the trailer. Instead of saying, these are young people who are struggling to make sense of God. Religion makes some huge claims. It's hard to negotiate those claims in modern America or anywhere else. People are struggling to negotiate that. Give them a little space, because that negotiation is crucial. We shouldn't stop it. So the first point I made is that we should engage and be creative. The last point would be creative in how we engage and to feel empowered. Secondly, was that we need to reshape our discourse between sheikh and student, scholar and people. And I realized I had someone come to me before and say, I just don't feel you're sheikh enough. And I said, why? And he said, you're not weird. Wallahi. And I said, what does weird mean? He says, do you have like a special costume you can wear? The red hat from Azhar? Is there something that can invoke within my heart this kind of esoteric need I have for craziness? And I was like, I don't roll like that. My teacher from Senegal, West Africa, was the most Sufi scholar I ever had in my life. He never missed his night vigil, but he dressed like the people. And he talked like the people. And when people saw him, they didn't even know who he was. And I found that far more empowering than costuming authority. Okay? So renegotiating that, and for us to say to you, you went to Kennedy School of Policy. I don't know, you know. But we can walk this bridge together. And the first point, of course, is being empowered by those axioms that the origin of things is good, as long as it's beneficial, it's permissible, and then that we've been brought out to bring benefit and prevent harm. Finally, on an individual level, it is very natural to struggle and make sense and grind through theology in your life. And it doesn't mean that you're bad. It doesn't mean that you're an evil person. Once someone came to the Prophet, peace be upon him, in Sahih Muslim, and he said to him, O Messenger of God, I have some jacked up thoughts in my mind. That's how it should be translated. Again, we have really destroyed translation. We have translated the vocabulary of the Arabs, but we took out the emotion of the translation. So it's translated like, O Messenger of Allah, I'm haunted by nefarious inclinations. That's not how he said it. He said it like this: I have some jacked up thoughts, man. This is really how it came across. And the Prophet didn't tell him, oh my God, you're so evil. The Prophet empowers him to engage those thoughts. And he says to him, really? And he was like, he got scared. He said, yes, yes. And the Prophet said, that's faith. That's faith. That negotiation, that attempt to make sense of things in the face of spiritual, physical, social, economic challenges, right? That's faith. So in your own personal lives, I think some of my lowest levels of faith I ever experienced were in Azhar. In Azhar. Simply because the negotiation process can be daunting, right? But it's very natural, very normal. May God bless all of you. It's a pleasure to be with you. I encourage you to read his book. It's a profound text. It really should help us. So we're late in the game. It was written in 65. I was born in 72. Come on. But it touches on, I think, some of the fear factors that haunt our community and other religious communities as well. And it impedes our ability to engage America, I think, and be part of a broader process. And that's why one of the things I'm telling people who want to interview me now is I am not going to be portrayed as a foreign imam. I'm not going to allow Islam to be portrayed as a foreign religion. I'm an American imam who speaks about what's important to my people, who might not be Muslim, and to talk about religion as a universal within the context of where we live. May Allah bless you. Thank you for your time. Assalamu alaikum.